Even though he lived and died almost 800 years ago, Genghis Khan has a negative reputation with a lot of people all around the world. And many think of him as a murderous monster. But was he really? To answer that, we'll look at his life and how he achieved what he did, and then we'll look at his accomplishments, his flaws, and why his reputation is so bad. Then you can answer the question, was he really a monster? Born near the Unan River in Mongolia, Genghis Khan's name wasn't even Genghis Khan. He was born Temujin, and he grew up extremely poor, even by the standards of the day, in his culture. When his father was poisoned to death, his family was abandoned by the wider tribe and left to die, but they somehow survived and built up a new one over time. He did some awful things to make sure he could advance in life. For example, he killed his older brother to ensure he wouldn't be subject to him for the rest of his life. Strictly taboo in most societies, and especially in his, which was very hierarchical. He suffered badly as a result, and only the kindness of some of the people around him enabled him to escape. Later, his first wife Pauper was kidnapped by a rival tribe, the Merkid. This wasn't a random attack. His father had kidnapped his mother from the same tribe, and this was revenge. Rather than mourn or move on, he fought back. He combined with his superior, Ong Khan, and his blood brother Jamaka to raid the Merkid and get Pauper back. Other tribes outside of the Mongols, and there were many, had managed to unite under a single Khan, but never the Mongols. Genghis wanted to become the first. He didn't have it all his own way though. His former best friend Jamaka also had his own plans to become Khan, and they had a battle that led to Genghis losing. Genghis slunk away, but Jamaka's behaviour in victory, including brutally torturing and killing Mongols, meant he lost followers over time. Genghis's whereabouts after are vague, but when he'd returned he picked up those that had deserted Jamaka and built up his power base again. By the end of it all, he was the first Mongol Khan, and as a result Temujin became the Genghis Khan we know and love. Through strategic alliances, he built up power by helping powerful Khans in their raids against other tribes until he was able to overthrow them in turn. He usually merged those tribes with his own and treated the majority as equals. He'd had a pretty eventful life by this point, but he saw the chance to do more and went for it. After uniting most of the tribes, he started to strike south into northern China whilst conquering other steppe tribes. China was relatively fractured at this point, and the north was controlled by former steppe tribes that had settled after conquering. They had become decadent by the Mongol standard, and so the Mongol army found it easier to defeat them and take all of their luxury goods as loot. This is how the steppe tribes worked. You generally beat your richer opponent and took their valuables. Conquering was rare, but Genghis changed that. He conquered northern China and inner Mongolia, and when conquering somewhere, he left the existing power structures in place, so long as they would send tribute to him. But guess what? As soon as he was far enough away, they rebelled. After this, he learned to execute those in power and put more loyal people in charge. He also changed what happened with the loot. Typically those that captured the loot got it. This would cut out anyone not able to fight. In contrast, he changed everything by collecting all loot centrally and distributing fairly. He also gave loot to widows and orphans of those who died in battle. This caused tension with some of the tribes he had integrated with, but he made sure no one would end up like his family had. The riches from these campaigns were beyond their wildest dreams, and far beyond anything most Mongols had ever seen. They didn't need to do much more, but Genghis's reputation grew. Hearing about him, the Uyghurs near Tibet asked him for help, as they were being persecuted for their Muslim faith in a Buddhist state. Sound familiar? He did what they asked and didn't loot them in return, as he genuinely believed that people should have religious freedom. After helping the Uyghurs, he was relatively ready to settle down and relax in his middle age. He could see how there was an opportunity to trade with other groups in the area, and the campaign to help the Uyghurs meant he had some knowledge of the trading routes towards Central Asia. If this were the end of his story, we'd barely even know of him. But we do, so something must have changed. He was calm and content and hoped to go back to Mongolia and live off trade. To start this off, he sent ambassadors to try to formally arrange a trade relationship with the Khwarezmian Empire in Central Asia. Their response? They executed them. A huge mistake. The Mongols had a complicated relationship with death. They didn't talk about it, and certainly didn't tolerate the murdering of their own by others or themselves. The emperor knew the Mongols may attack and put his army on high alert, confident they could beat a poorer group. But Genghis did something the emperor didn't expect. He marched through the Kizilkum desert and launched a surprise attack in the north, heading towards Bukhara, one of the richest cities in the area. Crucially, the emperor hadn't expected this, and had left it relatively undefended, so the Mongols snuck in and took it. After the insult of the murders of the Mongol ambassadors, Genghis showed no mercy. As we know from the campaigns in China, he executed those in power when capturing a city, and by the time he got to Bukhara, this was the pattern. But this time he went further. The difference here is that he ordered everyone else inside it to be enslaved. In the rest of his life, he conquered most of the rest of Persia, eliminating the Khwarezmian Empire. After this, he had a little dalliance trying to conquer northern India, but that didn't work out due to Mongol tactics and weapons not working well there. That touches on why they were so powerful and able to conquer much richer cities and empires. They didn't like to fight hand to hand, so how did they win? They did gain technology over time, but that just enhanced their tactics. No army can be truly devastating in the long term just from technology, as their opponent will get the same tech eventually. They generally didn't have more men in battles either, especially once they eventually reached Europe. Their main advantage was tactical. They used things such as the environment. For example, in northern China, they diverted rivers to flood the target, meaning those inside would have to run. In Central Asia, they used gunpowder to scare the opposition and their horses. They were amongst the first to use gunpowder as a weapon on a large scale. Instead of carrying around large siege equipment, they constructed siege equipment from the local materials once they reached the nearby target. Overall, they came up with clever ways to win sieges quickly. They also avoided direct hand-to-hand battle at almost any cost. How did they fight if not hand-to-hand? They were primarily horseback archers, which kept them mobile and away from needing to get close to their opponent. Very important when you have a culture-wide fear of death and blood being spilled. Another advantage is that they were unknown, and they didn't really know much about the world either. Although they conquered fast, they didn't rush in. A great example of their typical tactic is when one of his generals, who went on a little exploration north of the Caspian Sea to see what was there, and he discovered Georgia. What next? They showed up at the city gates with a small force. The knights inside armoured up, got on horseback and chased them, sensing an easy victory. After a day or two of riding, the Mongols allowed themselves to be caught up with, and the Georgians had it in the bag. Except they didn't. The place where the Mongols had stopped wasn't random. No. Silly Georgians. It was on ideal terrain for them, just happened to have the rest of the army there ready to pounce. By this stage, the Georgian army had broken up a bit because of the long chase and their knights getting excited by the prospect of finally fighting. Their poor horses were very tired because although bigger than the Mongol horses, they were not fast and weren't set up to chase for long periods. They were bred to hold very heavy knights and their armour. The knights were sitting ducks. The Mongols could pick them off one by one from a distance using their archery. They then rode back to the city gates they'd originally run from and took it without much of a fight. They didn't care about chivalry and being brave in battle. They saw no benefit to dying bravely. All that mattered was winning, and they nearly always did. Europeans would have been ashamed to win like this. More fool them. These tactics didn't work so well in mountainous northern India, and the humidity there affected the effectiveness of their bows, hence why India was relatively spared compared to Persia. Anyway, as he enjoyed the success in Central Asia and the riches coming to his people, Genghis fell off his horse and injured himself. He lived a while longer, but within a few years he was dead, around the age of 65. That was quite a life. Although he died almost 800 years ago, him and his descendants started a few things that have ended up shaping the modern world, for good or bad. As his empire grew and he started to split up the army to conquer different places at the same time, Genghis needed to have good communication. The fact that he controlled so much territory meant that he could put a postal relay system in place to spread messages quickly. Although modern postal systems started way later, the idea had been sown hundreds of years before with Genghis. Genghis and his successors are mainly known for their bloodlust, but really they liked fancy things. But after a few wars they had more than they needed or wanted. So what did they do with the excess? They enabled the excess to be traded between China and Persia. Persia was a lot closer to Europe, and this trade rekindled the famous Silk Road. And eventually, Venice, Genoa, and other Italian cities started trading with the Mongols and their amazing trade network. That kind of started the Renaissance. As we've seen, Genghis helped the Uyghurs when they were being persecuted for their Muslim faith. This is something he always looked to maintain. He didn't want religious conflict in his territory, and the majority of the people he governed didn't have his religion. That didn't matter to him. They all got treated equally. Speaking of changes he made when conquering places, both he and the Mongols, in general, didn't approve of torture. The body was sacred to them, and so if someone had to die, it was generally done quickly, without spectacle. Unlike Europeans in the same period and much later, who would turn torture and executions into entertainment. So that balances out some of the negative reputation, but you may have noticed that except for Georgia and the Caucasus, Europeans didn't have direct exposure to Genghis. Invasions in Europe would come from his successors, not him. But this is about Genghis, not them. So why do Europeans view him so badly? Matthew Paris, based in Hertfordshire, not Paris, wrote one of the earliest European accounts of the Mongols and Genghis Khan. It was negative straight off the bat, describing them in dehumanizing ways. In fairness to him, the accounts working their way to him were from refugees from the Russia campaign. The Mongols specifically released the refugees to spread rumours and win the psychological battle with their future enemies. They often gave cities the chance to give up before any blood was shed, and these refugees were a good way of making it clear that it was better to surrender than fight the Mongols. So we can give Matthew a pass on that, based on it being a deliberate propaganda campaign. Later, Chaucer wrote nicely about him in the Canterbury Tales, so it wasn't all negativity at the time. That came later. Fast forward several hundred years, and here we have Voltaire. In the 18th century, it was dangerous to criticise an absolutist European monarch, especially in France. So what did you do if you wanted to make your feelings known? You chose a story from history to turn into a play to thinly veil your attack, of course. He chose Genghis Khan and the Mongol Empire. The account is very negative and had a huge effect on how Europeans viewed Genghis. This then led to a little bit of racist thinking. In Europe, you say? Surely not. How? Well, apologies for the ableist slur, but Mongoloid was used to describe people born with facial features that were associated with the Mongols. That wasn't an accident, with the suggestion that mothers of the children had Mongol ancestors from the conquests. The inherent racism of the Enlightenment, which was generally anti-Asian, led to theories like phrenology or eugenics, which also put Mongols near the bottom of their highly scientific and not at all made up hierarchy of races. This combination of racism and ableism associated with them is also associated with Genghis. Obviously, Genghis was a conqueror, and so many people died as a result of his conquests. I'm not trying to counteract that. I would just say that the image of him being bloodthirsty and looking to cause destruction is a little unfair. We only need to look at him helping the Uyghurs, looking to settle down in Mongolia before he was baited into a war in Persia. He didn't start it, but nevertheless, the destruction caused by that war was immense, but not as large as we like to imagine. If he was such a butcherer, the population after he conquered the city would have been decimated, if the figures given around the time and since were accurate. Some give Bukhara a population of over 2 million, which would be very high for the time, but the figures within a decade or two show a slight reduction, not a decimation. Realistically, around 1/10 of the population was killed or taken prisoner when a place was conquered. He mainly looked to kill soldiers and those in power who could turn on him after he had left, but civilians would have died too. Instead of a mass murderer, it would be better to call him a destroyer of cities, as he often looked to simplify trade routes when two cities were too close and could compete with each other for the same trade. He'd have one of them destroyed to simplify the trade route. After all that, wouldn't it be interesting if we knew anything of what he thought about himself? We do. We have an account where he invited a Buddhist monk to meet with him, and they eventually did. He was very clear that he didn't see himself as someone special. He only won so much because his enemies weren't too clever. He was fairly humble and said he didn't indulge in luxuries, so he was a bit of a hipster. So that was Genghis Khan. Was he a monster? Let me know in the comments.